Hey everyone, I wanted to start another discussion regarding Monster Hunter Rise, and it's a very simple premise and a very simple question. And all I basically want to know is, how many of you guys do you actually enjoy the underwater combat in Monster Hunter 3, and would it be something that you would want to see implemented with the G-Rank version expansion in Monster Hunter Rise? This all comes about a few weeks ago. There was a lot of conversation and a lot of chatter in social media regarding underwater combat, if it was actually any good at all ever in Monster Hunter 3, or Try as a lot of people like to call it, and essentially if it was just merited ever coming back into the series in any way, shape, or form. And I noticed a lot of mixed reactions, to be quite honest. It was one of those things where, like, I presumed Monster Hunter's water combat wasn't necessarily the best, but I didn't necessarily take it to be as hated or to have a heated conversation as it turned out to be. But essentially what people were saying, that it was just because it was sluggish, it removed a lot of abilities for certain weapons, a lot of skill, and it just kind of made it just mashing the same ability over and over until you'll be able to just kill the monsters and eventually get out of the situation. And it took a lot of away what made Monster Hunter essentially Monster Hunter. Just the simple fact of you being able to hunt a monster, even though you're now in a different environment, which should be cool, should be interesting, but it took away too much of the essential nature of just the Monster Hunter combat and abilities. This reminded me a lot of the conversations that I saw back a couple of months back when in regards to the Rampage, where it was just kind of like an unnatural way for hunters to be able to just kill a bunch of monsters without ever putting themselves in danger. That's one of the real criticisms that the Rampage always got. It was that it's never really a dangerous situation, you're not really in danger, and ultimately it's just kind of like get the waves in, kill them, get the rewards, be done and over with, and there's no factor of like you're ever going to be able to get killed. And even if you do, there's no actual punishment for it, because it doesn't matter how many actually times you die in the Rampage, you just keep dying, you keep coming back, and there's no real punishment for any of that. So I did find that interesting that underwater combat was being referenced to the Rampage, and in that same sense, it always made me wonder if actually people wanted to see underwater combat ever make a comeback into Monster Hunter Rise in any way, shape, or form. Now, I don't necessarily know if this is actually going to be something that they would even consider implementing, and I'm talking about the developers themselves, because even when Monster Hunter World was released, there's a couple of quotes that we got from the developers at the time, specifically Kaname Fujioka, regarding, this is the game director for Monster Hunter World, that it was something that they wanted to implement, but they never actually were able to like finalize and be able to put into the game. And I'm going to quote them directly here, because there's a very specific quote from GameSpot from a few years back. It says, "We wanted to challenge ourselves to make underwater action and Try, because we had never been satisfied with how underwater sections worked in other games. And we wanted to see if we could make underwater action that still feels like Monster Hunter action. We worked really hard on it, but the amount of time and effort it takes to make underwater action work, we felt that in Monster Hunter World we were better off offering other things to do. So there's only a few parts where you're gonna dive underwater, but there's no main underwater action parts. As for what the future holds, I really got a strong attachment to it, so I'd like to try it again someday, but I really can't say." Now, once again, this quote is coming directly from the Monster Hunter World director, Kaname Fujioka, not necessarily having anything to do with Monster Hunter Rise. But since we know Monster Hunter Rise has already been in development, or at the very least the G-Rank expansion has been in development for over a year now, and we know that Monster Hunter World 2 is also in active development as well, which is, I believe, a 2023 release or something along those lines, according to that information that we got our hands on just a couple of months back, or probably over a year ago by now. So it's one of those things where, like, we know World 2 is at the very least going to be launching obviously on current gen consoles, PS5, Xbox Series, all that kind of stuff, most likely PC of course, and it's going to have like the better versions, visuals and stuff like that. But I do wonder if underwater combat would be something that they would want to consider to bring back, even if just it is for Monster Hunter Rise, for the nostalgia factor and pretty much nothing more. I do think that Monster Hunter Rise's G-Rank, or whatever the expansion will end up being ultimately called, is obviously going to get a lot of monsters and stuff like that. We've talked about that in the past, but it's going to be one of those things where, like, can they actually bring in a mechanic, not just monsters, but a mechanic that can make it so people can feel attached to actually want to come back and be able to play this game again, and it feels revitalized in a good and proper way, which is one of the biggest criticisms a lot of people have as of right now. Now, speaking of monsters themselves, Sadas and Gobule have to be back if there's any sort of underwater combat whatsoever. Those are two pretty much flagship underwater monsters that you definitely want to be able to fight underwater for sure. Sata's definitely, because it was just such a cool armor set that you got from it. And Gobule is one of those monsters that I don't necessarily think people remember the fight itself of how annoying it used to be, but at the same time, when you think back of just how different it actually was, it was one of those fights that you definitely want to be able to have. And Gobule is one of those monsters that we haven't necessarily seen a whole heck of a lot often since basically Monster Hunter 3. Then of course Lagiacrus is one of those monsters that by default just people are desperate to be able to see. I do think that my only real wrinkle to this entire theory or this entire conversation is that I do think Lagiacrus is most likely going to be one of those monsters that they're most likely going to hold for Monster Hunter World 2. It wouldn't necessarily something that they showcase or even decide to bring back for a Monster Hunter Rise expansion or anything along those lines. I think that is very much going to be one of those monsters that they're definitely going to try to save for the bigger game, the game that is most likely going to have the bigger budget. And I presumably think that Capcom thinks that is going to be one of those games that is going to sell more copies, obviously. So it's very much one of those, like, Laggy is probably going to get held off for World 2 by any case, even if there's underwater combat or not. That's just a personal belief that I have. But if they do introduce underwater combat and you don't have Laggy, obviously it would be one of those completely unacceptable things that a lot of people would definitely be complaining about. So I do think that Satas and Gobule coming back, of course with Laggy, if there's any sort of underwater combat, they would be pretty much at the forefront of that. Then that also brings the question, obviously, would they have to introduce more monsters or bring in any other of the older monsters to bolster up that underwater combat situation? Obviously, Plessy is one of those popular ones. Royal Ludroth is already in the game, so it's one of those like that can definitely bring back Pink Ludroth and stuff like that. So it would be no real issue, I think. Plessy and Green Plessy for sure would definitely have to come back. And then obviously new monsters. Whatever those new monsters, we do think that at the very least is going to be something along the lines of like 10 new monsters being added into the expansion, according to some of the rough information that we got very early on into the release of Monster Hunter Rise. So it's one of those things that, like, obviously plans change, things happen, but it's one of those that I do think that they're most likely going to do 10 or definitely more into the expansion. So one or two of those being, you know, water focused battles, I do think that they're willing to get weird with things. And it automatically makes me think of Somnicanth. She's ready to be essentially a underwater monster if you need her to be. It's one of those fights that I've always talked about, that like finding her is kind of like weird because she doesn't feel like all her abilities are being fully fleshed out. She definitely seems to be status focused, a little bit of weird, of just a non-traditional fight. But just because the sheer nature of like you fighting her in shallow water pretty much the entire time, it doesn't feel like she's fighting at her full potential. And if it's one of those underwater fights, I think Somnicanth can definitely shine. That could they still do the water, you know, shallow water type version of the fight? Absolutely. Laggy showcased that. Laggy was pretty much a shallow water and underwater monster, that there were two very specific fights with Lagiacrus. So it's one of those things where, like, it wouldn't necessarily surprise me if Somnicanth could have that same basic style of two separate battles that are completely different from one another. But like I said, I did want to have another discussion video. We haven't had one of those in a little bit, and I just want to hear your guys' takes. Do you miss underwater combat? Did you even actually try the Monster Hunter 3? And is it one of those things that you would love to see them to bring back into the series going forward, even if it's just for Monster Hunter Rise? But that's going to be it for this video. Hopefully you guys enjoyed it. If you are brand new to my channel, be sure to leave a like and subscribe. Hit the bell to receive notifications when the videos go up. And as always, thank you so much for watching. See ya.